Hi, everybody, and welcome to another Tapping Out of Trauma teleseminar. We really want to welcome our guest, Dr. Connie Dawson. My name is Suzanne Fagel, and my partner is...
And I'm definitely Craig Wiener.
So, without any further ado, I want to introduce Connie. Her career is centered in the fields of both mental health and education. She's an attachment-oriented therapist working with children who sustained early abuse and neglect and who have been diagnosed with reactive attachment disorder. And the treatment also includes their adoptive parents. So as an educator, she's taught a counseling education program at Portland State University, and she also taught pre-service teachers classroom management practices based on the understanding of family shame. She's co-authored several books for parents, recovering adults, and therapists based on developmental principles, Growing Up Again, and How Much is Enough. And we're having her here today because her latest book is called Life Beyond Shame, Rewriting the Rules. I'll say it again, Life Beyond Shame, Rewriting the Rules. And we'll give you more information about how you can get that book at the end of the interview. So she is also an invited member of the Worldwide Human Dignity and Humiliation Studies Network. And her chapter entitled Systemic Humiliation in Families will appear in a book that will be published this April called Systemic Humiliation in America, Finding Dignity in Systems of Degradation, which I'm sure is going to be quite an explosive book. So thank you and welcome.
Yeah, so thank you so much, Connie. I mean, being here as a part of our, we offered these free interviews twice a year before we start the Tapping Out of Trauma online webinar course. And as Suzanne mentioned to you, we really designed this to help to work with tapping EFT energy psychology practitioners and others, whoever tunes in, that really is interested in the relationship of the facilitation and healing of trauma. And of course, we're really going to go into much greater depth with you about the relationship between shame and trauma. And we do this starting 2 weeks before the course begins on March 23rd. And we also provide these as a service free. So it's really just such a joy to have you here. I'm so excited for today.
It's a joy to be here because shame is not a very attractive topic. And the more we expose it, the more we can become comfortable with it so it doesn't drive our bus. And so any bus we're driving, we can be in charge of where we're going with it.
Perfect.
So your questions, I'm sure, I can hardly wait to be focused on making a response.
Let's get going.
Okay. So the first question we want to just get things really clear is, what is the difference between shame and guilt?
Good one. Well, shame is that very internal feeling that who I am is not okay, somehow defective, something wrong with me. Guilt, on the other hand, is something that I have done and I can repair it, which is the difference. How do you repair your shame, which is what the book is about, and how, if I feel guilt, I feel it because bells clang in my head that I violated a value system that I have. So I can make that right by apologizing, by, all kinds of other means and matters of reconnecting. But for shame, the problem has been, how do I deal with it? But once we know how to deal with it, we can raise it up so that we can change it where it's changeable.
Great. So it sounds like, in a way, you're in charge of your own guilt in the sense that it's about your values.
Exactly.
Whereas shame is something that's done to you, as it were.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yes.
Good. Okay. So can you help us understand, from your perspective, the relationship between shame and trauma? Just generally?
Generally speaking, shame is trauma by a thousand cuts. I mean, shame is something that originates, the deepest kind of shame, buried, my secret, is the shaming attached to the time that where we're infants and small children without language. And so that's the trauma, is that's in us. Somebody else put it there. It wasn't our own doing, but unacknowledged, that shame becomes the trauma of something else controlling us. And it's diminishing our self-worth, this early stuff and the way we deal with it. Is that clear?
Yeah, so that's more what you would call unearned shame?
Yes. Yes.
Okay. And
Yes.
then what's earned shame?
Well, earned shame is that I have enough cognition and brain development to be able to understand that there are boundaries and limits that are set for me in my culture. So this material inside the square the boundary, that's okay. If I step across the boundary, I know ahead of time there are consequences. That kind of shame can really support cultural norms, and so but that's decided. I step across that boundary. That's kind of earned.
So that's not, it's really the unearned shame that we're talking about that can lead to trauma.
Right. And if you think about it, the whole point is kind of unmasking the shame that might be ours, or that we hold, and turning it into guilt, because it really is not anything that we did. It was pretty much our adaptations to the people and the circumstances around us.
Connie, I want to try to make it real for people, and I love what you're saying, but let's try to maybe infuse some examples of what one or another might look like, if you don't mind. I think that would be really helpful for listeners.
Absolutely. Okay. Unearned shame is when, for instance, preverbally, all an infant and young child is a mass of their feelings. They don't have language, so that when I emerge from a mother, and maybe my mother has deep depression, postpartum, but I don't know that. I just know that I cry like crazy, and she doesn't come. And I, being so, in my limited, self-centered world, I think it's my fault. I must be ineffective because I can't get her to come, and I can't feed myself. Okay. So if she won't come and feed me, there must be something wrong with me. I'm not doing this the way other people do it. I can't do it. I mean, that's an example. And the earned shame is when my friend and his girlfriend in college were by the edge of a lake on a moonlit June night, and hormones are rising for both of them. And my friend has a determination he was not going to be engaging in premarital sexual activity. And so as the hormones rose, he suddenly decided that he scooped up his girlfriend and they both plunged into the lake, which effectively stopped. It helped him pay attention to a boundary that was important to him, and he was not willing to violate his own boundary, and letting nature take its course.
Understood. I got it.
Yeah.
Okay, so if today we're focusing on shame-based trauma, what are the essential origins of this? In your book, you discuss what you call the 7 shame-based rules. Perhaps you could illustrate briefly and give an example of how they operate?
Mm-hmm.
Oh, yeah. Yes, absolutely. These rules were first articulated by family therapists who were working with families who were in recovery. That is, somebody in a family had been through treatment, were in recovery. And they noticed that the family interacted based on a set of rules that nobody posted. They weren't on the refrigerator, you know, like we usually put the rules on the refrigerator. They were just assumed, but they were so powerful because they weren't on the refrigerator. No kid could go up and say, look, number 3 isn't working for me. Let's talk, you know, like an open system would. So the rules are, the first one's really the basis of them all. And that is do and be right. Now, when parents say that, what they mean is do it my way.
Exactly.
Right is how I do it. So you do it my way. And so that's, but seldom do they tell you what a right way is and teach you a skill. Rather, what they'll do is they'll find you doing it the wrong way, and then they will go after your personhood. They'll go something like, what's wrong with you? I've told you this a million times. What, can't you ever get anything through your head? And you know, that's that beginning thing, is that I start to pile up this defectiveness in my internal self, and my goodness, these people who are supposed to love me are really just criticizing me or finding me wrong. So
I just want to really acknowledge how beautiful that is. That's so brilliant, and I don't think that there's anybody out here listening that hasn't experienced that. So
well, that's been my experience, Greg, over 30 years of talking about this stuff, is that there are very few people who don't recognize that. And we have to give families a little bit cut them a little slack here, because these rules are passed down from one family to another. I mean, if they knew how to do something different, they would have done it different if it had a better outcome for them, because they don't seek to have pain. That's my belief. So yeah, it's important that they raise them up and know that that they labor under that misapprehension that they're all perfect. And I have to remind you that if you get perfect, you ascend. Perfect people seem to rise and go somewhere else. Since we're all here, we all share that as a measure of what we believe. So I don't want you to see that, though. So rule 2 immediately comes in. If you shine a spotlight on me, I want that spotlight off me as fast as I can, because you're going to see that I'm defective. So I'll blame anybody and anything to change the subject, to get it over here. You know, that even goes to the dog ate my homework. I mean, I had nothing to do with leaving my homework next to his box or whatever, you know, I didn't care for the homework as I should have. It has something to do, but no matter. And when you're in a family that with these rules, you're always getting blamed all the time for things you didn't do, or suspicion for things you didn't do. But it's that blame thing just shoots around in a family, where if you make a mistake, you better figure out how to get out from under it, so that people don't get you. Why? Because usually deeply inside of us, if we are so ashamed, in other words, if people might run away from us, what are we going to do if we're left all alone?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, hey guys, you know, my real fear is that if you see how defective and Swiss cheese holy I am, that you won't have anything to do with me. Rule 3, do not acknowledge your feelings. The reason why is that feelings really tell you the truth. And all you have, by the way, to get any read on your environment when you're a little kid, especially a preverbal kid under the age of 3, let's say, all you have is to get what's going on in your environment is the stuff that you're picking up through your feelings, mad, sad, glad, scared, and so on. So, for instance, a new mother with a 3-month-old baby asked if she could be a part of a workshop that I was facilitating, a week-long thing. And as part of the workshop, people had to be in group. I said you could participate to this. She was a social worker. You could certainly participate if the people in your group don't mind. So go to them and say, if it's okay that you bring your baby to this group situation. And she did, and the group quickly figured out that the baby would get restless and cry and get fussy when there was any conflict going on in the group, even if it wasn't being actively talked about.
Mm-hmm.
And as soon as they would deal with the conflict in, between two or more people in the group, the baby would settle right down without being fed, without anything else. But that's the miraculous way that babies get a read on what's going on just through their affective self. It's the only thing that they have.
Okay.
So when you don't have your feelings, and the other thing is feelings tell you the truth. And if we can't stand it to deal with the truth, and we can't stand with what is right in front of us, we put it somewhere else. Those things can get buried so deeply.
Sure.
Yeah. So are we into rule 4?
Great. We are.
Rule 4 is keep secrets. And because, if you don't want it shouted from the rooftop, which I don't, if I feel I'm, in effect, whatever I am where I feel my biggest doubts about myself, that I will want that kept a secret. And in a family with a secret, everybody is supposed to keep that secret. The fact that your older sister gives birth to who has just lavished attention on you, and the older sister gives birth, and suddenly your own parents are bringing an infant into the house because they say they've adopted this infant, when in this woman who was a young child at that time could hardly, she didn't understand why her older sister that had had such a good relationship with her suddenly dropped her and paid all this attention to the baby. She was an adult before the secret came out that the baby was in fact her older sister's child, and her parents adopted the child and brought her into the family. But this very, very bewildered 8-year-old always thought there was something about her that her older sister, preferred, and didn't pay any attention to her. Always wondered why. So keep secrets, and families seldom teach people the difference between a secret and privacy.
Mm-hmm.
We all have our ways to be private, and it's just our own business because it doesn't impact anybody else. So keep secrets. The fifth one is something that's really has always been hard for me to kind of take myself. But the rule is don't be clear and don't be accountable. Be unclear, because it's unsafe in this family to be clear.
Mm-hmm. Got it.
So if I tell the truth, or if I beat around the bush, because you ask me a question like, do you want to go to the movie? And I'll say, well, let's see. What is it? And what time does it start? And blah, 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 blah. I won't say yes or no because it's too clear. I had a very difficult time with that myself.
Mm-hmm.
Because it was like taking a stand and being clear, and standing on your own ground was just, it was too tentative a place, and I was fearful about being clear. But
risky, very risky.
Very risky, very risky, and very risky to be accountable, because then you have to be accountable. Who in this family would want to be accountable? Because there's so much interactional stuff floating around that isn't good for anybody. Mm-hmm. So I think we're on rule 6.
Yeah.
Is in such a really free-floating, anxiety-filled, stress-filled environment, the whole idea is that your needs are not okay with somebody else. You've already learned that, and that you had better get your needs met in some way. So if you need to have dad do this, hey, how do you manipulate dad to do it? how do you manipulate mom to give you this? And then if it goes past in adult relationships, we see this all the time. So if I'm not clear about what I tell you what I need, then what I do, of course, is I can flip right straight into manipulation to get you to do what I want you to do. I manipulate you to get me to love you, or you to love me, sorry. So I change all the storm windows in the house. You know, when my husband is off on a hunting trip, thinking when he gets back on the hunting trip, he will be so happy that I did that. It relieved him of the pressure to do that. And then he gets home and I'm thinking I'm going to get attention in a very positive and loving way. And when he gets home, he doesn't notice that I've done it. And so it's that if in a relationship, if manipulation and so on doesn't work, then coercion and escalating to levels of violence, because in the end, that's what all that leads to. If I need you to do it my way, and I don't care what you need, I'm only concerned with my own, then all bets are off. Is that a good enough example for you?
Well, so I'd like to ask a question here. So would this be an example of this? So let's say you have a woman that's being abused because she can never get it right.
Right.
At whatever her husband does. So he escalates to violence because he's so angry that she doesn't get it. So she's shamed, but it also sounds like what you're saying is he comes from a shamed family that he needs to be so in control.
Absolutely.
Okay.
Because if he respected his own needs and saying, and asked for her support in her meeting them in which way she can, or that he meets his own, he would have no need to do that.
Right.
He would have no need to do it. His life would not depend on her doing things exactly the way he needed her to do them.
Right. And of course, that leads to trauma.
Yes.
So the last rule.
Also, the last rule is the one that kicks it all right down the line. It's called deny reality. So the rule is, hey, whatever's going on around here, so it may feel awful. It may, they're bickering all the time. There are alliances in this family. Let's you and me play whatever against her, and so on and so forth. So let's pretend that's not going on. It's just not going on because nobody sees a solution to it. Nobody knows what to do differently. So the real kicker is deny reality means that you can go to that place where you create your own. There are examples of that all over the world right now. It's like, if I can't acknowledge my own reality, then I create one for myself and operate out of that. So here's what I pretend to be. Here's how I define things to be. It's pretty serious. Anyway.
Well, it sounds like it really takes a toll on your soul when you have to be that way for your whole life. And
well, because when you think about it, it's all about don't be who you are. Don't exist in some families.
Yeah.
It's just, and the thing is, it's so endemic to so many cultures that we forget how destructive that is of human beings and who they are, and treating people with dignity, not with humiliation.
Right.
Yeah.
Now, Connie, I know that you have half the book is also the antidotes to the rules or new rules. So everybody, you're going to have to get the book and read it because we're not going to have time here to go into all of that. And we want to stay with the theme of shame and trauma. But just know Connie has lots of good solutions in the book to the old rules.
And ways to get there.
Yes.
Because it's not just like pulling your overcoat back and saying, okay, here it all is. It's like there are ways to get there. It's really coming back to yourself, the self you were meant to be, the self that God or whatever higher power meant you to be.
I love that, because really so many of the listeners here that are using EFT or similar modalities, part of the statement of I deeply and completely accept myself
Yeah.
is the perfect moving towards how do I accept that who I am is enough? How do I accept that who I am is good enough and whole enough and smart enough, and I accept however I am, and so I love that we're moving in the same direction, just from different paths.
Absolutely. And you know, the thing that is so entrenched about this is that the culture supports it, because almost everybody has been marinated in this,
Right.
because the schools are run and the institutions are run so often by this same thing. We treat people as bad rather than the capability of being good, and it all comes from the outside. This is all the thing that they said. Identify the voices that you remember from your earliest childhood. That's what you need to change, because that came from the needs of your parents, not from you, not from who you are. Anyway, stop it.
I find it so fascinating that as ubiquitous as you're saying as shame is, we rarely hear it in our vocabulary. It's this whole idea for me of shame is elusive, and you don't have people walking around saying, I feel shame, I feel shamed. And yet we're seeing it's just in everything. So my next question is that when we start to look at shame coming through all these different ways, but people not necessarily identifying that what's holding me back in life is shame,
Right.
that it's tricky, because from parents there can be both loving and shaming, and so in this tricky field, one of the things that I saw in the book that intrigued me was this idea of shame hooks.
Yeah.
That in this convoluted nature of shame, how as an adult working on ourselves or if working with clients, we can help identify a shame-based trauma by the ways we get hooked and how it affects us and what kind of things trigger us through that core of shame. And I was wondering if you could talk about that shame hooking that you discuss in the book.
Absolutely. You know, the shame hook as an adult is when you feel frozen, powerless, or maybe even rageful inside, but you can't show it, or maybe do. So if you have that reaction that is very familiar to you, that's a key to look back and see where that originated, because you didn't just make it up.
Right.
It isn't just because, oh, let's see, I think I will. You know, it's a response that was that's a hook back to an earlier response. So, and nobody likes that feeling of having to hide, because that's a shame response. It's like, oh my gosh, get me out of here.
Right.
You know, I did a talk in a suburb of Cincinnati when I was first employed by, never mind, and had to do this talk, and I had never done the talk before, but I had somebody else's notes about how they did the talk. Well, I just flopped like you can't believe. I'm up there in front of a whole school district full of faculty, and I'm going, I don't even know what came out of my mouth, because I felt like I wanted the floor to open up and for me to drop from sight.
Mm-hmm.
The humiliation was so big, and of course my supervisor wouldn't let me hire somebody else to do the talk either. I had to go out and do it. But it's that, then I have to look back and say, oh, remember the time I couldn't remember my lines? I was about 4 and I was in the Sunday school program for Christmas Eve, and I knew my lines backward and forward, but I could not remember my lines, even if my mother was in the second pew whispering loud, helps for me to get started. And I wanted to just scream and run out, and I didn't want anybody to look at me. It's that wanting, and so a shame hook right now in our adult life can be a clue to going back and saying, how did that get started?
Exactly. And I love that, because that's so much of what we're doing in tapping is we're showing, where is an overreaction now? Where am I finding myself getting incredibly hooked?
Yeah.
I know it seems like it's about the moment that just happened, but if I get that significantly emotionally hooked, there's a trail from our past to go back to and to start to find resolution to. So thank you so much. That's so relevant to the work that all people that are doing EFT are doing every day. So thank you.
So in conjunction with that, I mean, so we can, as practitioners and even for ourselves, look at where are those hooks and work back from there. But also, Connie, can you tell us, are there physical symptoms that, like, if you have somebody in front of you, you might be able to say, I wonder if this is a shame response?
Mm-hmm.
Well, it's I suppose you have to look at a lot of different factors, but there are some pretty common ones for children. It's head down. It's the feeling inside for children and adults of being frozen and just dissociating, just really wanting to vacate while standing right there in the flesh, wanting to be not there. And so there are three really common patterns that we've noticed about how people protect themselves from being seen or react to having been seen. So one of them is rage. If you get immediately rageful, if you're foolish, if you've got a lot in your background, you've been name called, you've been criticized, you've been humiliated 1,000 times, that if somebody opens that door at all and sees you, one way to regulate distance to push them away is with rage. I'll show you, that kind of response. Because, well, I'm going to stop right there with the rage. Another way is with contempt. Because you can control a situation and react defensively by turning your back on somebody, which means it's not my fault, it's yours. Or I'm contemptuous of you, that kind of thing. I don't know how many people I'm trying to think of a situation where, well, it's one of the keys to what is one of the biggies about what breaks up relationships, adult relationships, is that if you can't be heard, you instead are somebody, people learn that that's the best way to protect yourself is just to cut it off because they're getting too close to you, or they're going to a place where you don't know in yourself. The other one is perfectionism. And I can't help but thinking of a lot of experiences that I've had with people who are dealing with things like anorexia. There's no way they can make themselves perfect enough to be okay, to be loved. Perfectionism, I won't make mistakes. If I make a mistake, it's as sure as just saying, I'm faulty. I mean, I'm not okay. So that drive to be perfect, keeps people at bay, and it is a sign in myself that there's something I have to look at.
I might add one physical response just because it was a personal one for me. Between the age of probably 5 and 12, you could not take a photograph of me without my eyes tearing and welling up. It was almost as if somehow looking into the camera, I was going to be seen. I mean, I remember the physical sensation of literally looking into a camera, and it wasn't fear, so it was closest to shame of like, you'll see me if you take that picture. And so I hated having pictures taken because of that physical sensation of tearing up or red-eyed, of that kind of head-bowed feeling. So I really want to thank you. That's a perfect representation of that.
Yeah, that's okay, good. That's a good example.
Okay. All right, let's go to, so when we're dealing with shame and trauma, we've been talking about both adult and childhood experiences, and that's where we're going to go right now. So when we look at the seeding of trauma that is shame-based or leads to feelings of shame, that can happen as an adult experience, something that you did with a partner as an adult, right. But also, as you've pointed to, so many times it's rooted in early traumatic life experiences that most people know as adverse childhood experiences or ACEs.
Mhm.
And I'm just wondering what you've noticed, how shame shows up in an adult that's been laid down from adult experiences that have created the shame versus childhood ones, and how that shows up differently for people.
Hmm.
Or if you have, yeah.
Well, the shame is something that as an adult you can talk about if you're under the right circumstances, if people are willing to hear and somebody you trust. But yeah, the cognition to look at what happened and decide who is responsible. Like say an interaction, you've had a terrible, distressful situation with your boss. So you have the ability cognitively to sit down and say, how much of that is him and how much of that is me?
Right.
I mean, because maybe his shame is coming out and his way of controlling you or being a good boss is to say, shape up in 30 days, I expect to look and see and look at this XYZ behavior that's unacceptable and it will be different. Well, wait a minute. If the boss doesn't say, and I'll help you figure this out, or I'll get you the help you need to figure this out or to develop this skill I need you to have. And adults are fully competent then to think about the situation and to think about the responsibility and to say, I can change the shame to guilt. If there's what in it here that I can do, that if he's talking about my behavior and I'm feeling like, it's shame, it's a shame interaction, is that then I will get very direct with somebody and I will say to him, well, I understand you don't like this piece I've written for the newsletter. Will you tell me exactly what you're thinking about? So that, that's that going back to, he wants me to do it his way and he didn't tell me to do it his way. In the first place, he didn't tell me what it was. It was only when it wasn't his way that he started criticizing. Well, do we really do that? Can you say that to clients? Someone, no, we really do it, Tom. So as an adult, I can thread my way through. As a kid, you don't have the power to do that so much.
Right.
So that you are vulnerable because you don't have you have options as an adult you don't have as a kid.
What if you're a child, just to go in between those two, a child that has a strong childhood of shame becomes an adult. And while we want to say, oh, you have the cognition as an adult to be able to say, oh, that's just about my behavior. If you have a history of shame, that ability to make that discrimination is not so easy.
You got to go back. You just have to find out the origins of the shame, because 99 times out of 100 isn't your fault. It was the decision that you made at a time when there was chaos or stress or criticism or conflict where you were living. And because of your orientation and the development of your cognition, first of all, the world does not revolve around you, but you think it does, so it's all your fault. There should be something you could do to stop it. And you can't. You don't have that kind of power. But kids in latency age, like elementary school, when they find things are going on in their family they don't like, they simply go and spend a lot of time in their friend's family that isn't like theirs.
Right.
So they have some way to get out from under some of the experiences that they might have at home.
Okay, so I want to ask a question off of this.
Yeah.
And that is it possible, if you don't have a shame-based childhood, and I mean, I'm not talking about, a little shame here and there that, anyway. And is it possible for you to develop shame as an adult? And I will give you an example of what I think that might look like. Say you have been in a bad accident or a natural disaster or war, and as a result of that, you develop significant trauma. Now, and I think that there can develop a sense of shame because you feel defective, like, what's wrong with me? Why can't I pull this back together again? So there's a sense of shame that develops. But it seems to me that it can happen as an adult as a result of some kind of trauma, that the shame then comes out of the trauma. Am I off base here, or is that also?
Well, I can see that certainly in times when that post-trauma, that
Yeah.
you say to yourself, I shouldn't have done that. I should have done this differently, and question yourself. But, lots of times if you take in that trauma that you didn't handle things properly or the way you should have, that you might not want to be, like if you were in a ski accident, you hit a tree going down a hill.
Right.
You wouldn't want people to know that, because that says what? Everybody knows about shame, and everybody's got little bits of it here and there, so that hey, I don't want anybody to know I plowed into a tree.
Yeah, but I'm thinking also of, like, say, a returning soldier from a war.
Oh, definitely.
Who just, he's ashamed because he can't control how he's feeling.
No, right.
Everything's out of control because of the trauma, because of the PTSD. And the shame is actually the like, what's wrong with me now that I can't pull myself together?
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I had a client once who said, who had experience in the Vietnam War, and he came in one day just almost shaking to his appointment, and I said, what happened? Because he looked just drained and just like, it feels like the cells aren't organized. He was just all free floating anxiety. And on the way to the office, he had driven his car over a loose manhole that made an awful bang, an awful sharp noise, that he had no control over. But just that sound and just disorganized him. And he went right back to that prior experience of being in a war zone.
Sure.
Then I had another client who made such efforts to not let his girlfriend know that he was in Vietnam, that he had other people writing notes that he would write to her, and mail people who were leaving to come back to the States, and mail them from the stateside, so that she would not even know that he was there. And it took him quite a while in group to be able to go out to the Vietnam, the marchers, and come out in his community as a person who was even involved in the war.
Sure, perfect example.
Yeah.
I just wanted to clarify a little bit. Many practitioners understand when we refer to trauma. I just wanted to offer a little clarification. And of course, there are many different definitions, but with shame and trauma, we're talking about events that happened where a person feels isolated, where they feel alone, where they feel helpless, where they feel threatened in some way. And whether it's a big T trauma like Suzanne mentioned, like war, or natural disaster, or car accident, or abuse, etc., shame can come from smaller T traumas, which was ones that you described, which is complete in the front of a classroom, or embarrassment, and all of a sudden feeling like you are totally isolated, alone. You've frozen because you can't hide from that moment. And so, especially depending on resources and age, those moments of taking in that shame of unworthiness and of I don't deserve to be here and I can'tness can come from small moments that might not seem to a big deal as an adult, but to a small child is everything.
Well, they're so self-centered if they're small, and of course, yes. I mean, they're so self-centered, everything is about them, and they should be able to do it, anyway. That's that death by 1,000 small traumas. Right. And you see, once one does some work and going back to where the shame originated, let me say this. I'm sorry, I'm getting disjointed here. But I think lots of times in terms of going back, you have to do some research, and you have to have other people, ask other people questions about what your infancy was like, because your parents don't want to come up with that information often either. And most of us don't have conscious memories of most things that happened to us until at least the age 2.5 or 3. And so if you've got to get information about what was going on, like your mom was postpartum and she really loved you and so on and so forth, but your dad would come home at noon for lunch and you'd be almost hoarse from crying to get her to feed you. That stuff is, that stuff is kind of unknown, again, because parents know that that's not something they're proud of or that even they could be in control of. But it was a situation where the child is. So it's that preverbal stuff. And even with some of my own therapy, the prenatal stuff is even important.
Yeah, that's a powerful area.
The child is being pummeled by a battering father or husband. I mean, that's all picked up. There's a wisdom in every cell in our bodies. And that's all somewhere picked up. But we have to remember that without having language, you can't make meaning of things. It's all just there.
Right.
It's in you.
And I love that you said that two things, and then I want to go on to the next question. One is, at a young age, it's all about me and it's always my fault. Just infuses us, and it becomes the perception of just who we are. We don't make a distinction of an event or somebody else. It just becomes a part of the fabric of us.
Exactly.
But I want to look at how that then is as an adult. So even if you've been a person that's had this long-lasting kind of shame sense, it doesn't necessarily show up as an adult like I'm this person that feels shame. No. Right? So in other words, people are listening going, well, I don't carry a sense of shame. I don't feel a sense of shameness. That's not an adjective I use to describe myself or my life. And yet shame imbues so many different ways. So my question is, how have you seen shame show up in different ways and in different arenas of people's life that they wouldn't necessarily define it as shame?
You don't know until you start pressing. If people are, I start here generally, if people aren't comfortable with what they're doing, or they have repeated relationship failures, or they are extremely obsessive about certain things in their lives that disturb them, or they run into repeated failures at work, or they've ideated or attempted suicide. I mean, those are places where. What was your question?
Well, it actually, it's interesting because it runs into the next question, given your answer.
Yeah.
But it really is, whether we're a practitioner or a client, we're looking at when somebody comes in with a relationship issue, a work challenge, a health issue, whatever it is that they come in, how as a person or how as a practitioner do we have some sense that shame might be at the core?
I think by what's happening in their current life and seeing what kind of rerun that takes on from before. Is there a pattern of this in their lives? Has this happened before? What's the earliest time you remember X, or can you, whatever. I mean, everybody remembers the first time their parent did this.
Okay.
We can't see what you're doing.
Oh, can't see what I'm doing? Like this.
Thank you.
What does that mean?
Shame on you.
Everybody know. I mean, I have never talked to an audience that didn't know exactly what that meant. It just tells you about how common and how much of this we're marinated in. And I don't think you can say, I mean, I was challenged once to come up with an exercise for people about shame and about kind of gradations of shame. I couldn't do it, because the shame that anybody carries is not more or less or whatever else from, that's out of their family experience. there's no way to gradate it because lots of other things go along with it. For instance, I even made a list, the age of when it first occurred, the cognitive ability of the person making the adaptations, all of this, the particular mentality or gifts. I know as for kids who were very abused and neglected in their early childhoods, it was easier to do therapy and to make changes with a child who maybe carried an IQ or whatever or was adjudged to be a slow learner. It was easier to do therapy and make changes with that than a very smart kid.
Why?
They could figure out, hey, I can get along without these parents, so I'm 10. I can live in the woods. I've read books, it's like, and they figure they're more clever and deceptive and can find more ways to get around.
So, I just want to tease out one more piece and then I'll hand it back to Suzanne. So somebody shows up with, again, a relationship, a health, a work issue, and we know that the dysfunctionality or the challenges that they face have a history and go back, right? Does the discovery of shame simply show up in the working of that trail of events, or do you have a sense, is there any cues for you that when somebody shows up that shame is at the origin of that?
If they can go back to a previous thing in their lives, listen to their language and how they're describing it. So they will they will have an assumption in there that can lead you to the next question to ask them, or the next thing that you deal with the tapping, to get past that, one. Even asking somebody to say, I am a whatever, a loving, what is it that
I deeply and completely accept myself. I'm able to love myself. There are different affirmation phrases, but to accept myself is at the heart of that.
Yes. Yeah. So when someone has difficulty saying that, how do you know that?
Right.
How do you know that? They will be resistant. They will be reframing in any possible way not to use they want to keep a secret from you. See, this is something.
The tapping won't be effective.
Right. Yeah.
Because they don't have a buy-in into the affirmation statement.
No.
Right.
Because and they really don't. You know what? So then ask for some messages they remember.
Mm-hmm.
Pick somebody in your family. Pick your dad. Pick your mom. Whatever. Do you remember something that they told you that was hard for you to hear? Or that relates to the current difficulty in their lives. They'll come up with something because they want to please you. As a practitioner and as somebody who they recognize as being helpful to them, they'll want to do as you invite them to do, I think. If they're not, then they probably are sitting in another chair somewhere. Because they come because they know they have this dis-ease.
Right.
They know that there's something that's missing. And that guiding them and helping them move to what it is, and that it's not their fault. Also, implicit in this is that people don't like to, people are very loyal to their families. And they'll do lots of things to protect their families. They'll say lots of things to protect their families. So you invite them to be specific about the words that were used. What did you hear your dad say when you made a mistake? That kind of stuff.
Perfect. Suzanne, I think you had one final question to wrap up.
Yeah, thank you so much, Connie. This has been really great. But I want to, just before we end, because I'm aware of your work with the cultural humiliation. So I want to broaden our last question to sort of ask if you could discuss the difference between shame as an experience or felt sense with emotional and physical elements versus more global beliefs that can have far-reaching effects beyond the specifics of any one single traumatic shaming experience. So like, for example, like tribes in a country or something where one is good and the other one is always being kept down, that kind of thing.
Well, I think immediately of the Rwandan genocide. The way that happened was, of course, historically, there were lines drawn when Europeans came and then carved Africa up into nations. And when they drew those lines, they drew them convenient to them, but dividing tribes and not taking the tribal areas in mind and the culture areas in mind. And so Hutus, in order to, I mean, this took generations, but the Hutus kept putting down the Tutsis, and they humiliate them. So they say, you know, they can't do this, they don't do that. Oh, they're not very smart. They blah blah blah. Whatever criticisms that of sidelining this whole group, and then they kick them to the curb, and then they make them and they reduce them, and they keep that up until they are vermin. You can consider them not important and not worth living. And so it's at that point when you can just roll right over the top and, well, there's nothing that keeps us from just, with the right ginning up, from destroying them and to taking after them with machetes.
And of course, the same thing happened in Nazi Germany with
all the time. Yeah.
And is happening in America now.
It seems to be. It seems to be that we've got one of the things about the shame system is you're either good or bad. Mm-hmm. So there isn't any in between. You're either right or wrong. Remember rule 1, do and be right. Right. So the more I can make you wrong, the more I can hopefully assert that I am right. And then, of course, if I've got to fight about that, I mean, if the conflict cannot be resolved and both people can't be sane and express to one another their difficulties and be heard, that, you know, we see it all over.
Yeah.
The whole world, because if we operated on the basis that everybody deserved dignity, and if you did behaviors that were contrary to practices that your tribe or group or culture group agreed with and saw as best for the tribe, everybody, you know, came to that agreement, negotiation, things would be different, you know. Many things are being done all over the world in terms of restorative justice and reconciliation. And the chapter in the book that's coming out in April, which is a textbook, includes how there is systemic humiliation in our justice system, in terms of racial inequality, economic inequality. There are these shame assumptions that some are better than others. It's not what you contribute to the group, it's what you can get from somebody that you can prove is weaker than you.
Mm-hmm. Which, of course, parallels what's going on in family systems as well.
Yes. So my hope is that if anytime anybody changes one of those rules for themselves, things in their family changes. Right. The relationships in the family are bound to change because they have to adapt to somebody else. If I start telling the truth, I may be cast out of my family as an adult for a while because it's too disturbing to the family. But you know, when they see that my life can be better, that I can be more honest with myself and others, and feel less like hiding and dancing on the head of a pin to try to stay, you know, stay hidden. That's one at a time, one person in one family at a time. I would like, in the book there are those replacement rules, and I would love it if everyone who hears that posts the old rules, I call them, and the new rules, and then leaves it up for discussion in their families about which ones they'd choose to put on the refrigerator.
Right. And the best way to find those out
Right,
would be
is by reading Connie's book, Life Beyond Shame, Rewriting the Rules, available through Amazon. And the author, if you happen to live on Whidbey Island. And Connie, we thank you so much. We know there's so much in the book that wasn't time to cover here. So those of you who are listening, we really urge you to look at the book and find out how the many strategies Connie has for working with shame, because obviously as EFT practitioner, energy work practitioners, or anybody, it behooves us to do our own work so that we can better help our clients, as Connie will attest in her own field. So thank you so much, Connie.
You're so welcome. It's been a pleasure. Thank you, Suzanne, Greg.
Thank you so much. And for all the viewers and listeners out there, if you enjoyed this, know that this is the kind of work that we do, except we get even more direct with the applications and experiential part for integrating it with tapping.
Right.
So the course is coming up. We only offer it twice a year. It's an 8-week course. Tappingoutoftrauma.com. You can register. The class begins on March 23rd. Registration is now open at tappingoutoftrauma.com. There are, if you're a professional that's looking for continuing education hours, there's 19 CEs for counselors and LMHCs and marriage and family therapists and nurses. And if you go on the site as well, you'll see past free webinars and interviews that we've done as well that are archived there. So for those of you that are returners to Tapping Out of Trauma, keep listening. We're working on creating a Tapping Out of Trauma Part 2 for this next year. For those that have never attended Tapping Out of Trauma, we hope that you join us. There's an online group. There's live Q&A calls and webinars, video webinars. So we just want to thank you for attending today and for listening. We're just grateful to be able to make a contribution, and we're ever so grateful for Connie for being with us today and sharing her work with us. So thank you, Suzanne. Thank you, Connie, and thank you, listeners and viewers.
And please do carry on.
Promise.
Yes.
Okay, bye, everybody.
Bye, Connie. Bye, Suzanne. Bye, everybody.
Bye.